but it's an undeniable fact that churches, communities, denominations, and countries where the gospel is shared most are the places where the church is growing the fastest. Places where the gospel is not shared are the places where the church is declining the fastest.
Moikka moi ja tervetuloa Kujalla.podcastin pariin. Täällä keskustellaan teologiasta ja ajankohtaisista asioista. Tänään puhutaan siitä, mitä kristinuskolle kuuluu globaalisti. Ovatko seurakunnat pienenemässä ja kutistumassa niin kuin täällä Länsimaissa näyttää, vai onko kenties jotakin suurempaa kasvua jossakin muualla päin maailmassa? Ja haastattelussa tänään meillä on Jason Mandryk Etelä-Koreasta, ja hän on Operation World-kirjan kirjoittaja ja sen työn johtaja. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
Great to have you here. So you work with the Operation World project. And first of all, maybe you could just briefly explain to our viewers, what is it all about?
Sure. The most simple explanation would be that we compile prayer information about every country in the world using research and gathering information. So the combination of research with prayer is our wheelhouse. And the origin of Operation World as a ministry began in the 1960s in Southern Africa, where various apartheid regimes made it difficult for local Christians to have access to information so that they could pray. And as the result of the work of a missionary to this region, he began to do research through his international connections, which grew into a larger and larger resource as the decades passed by.
Wow. So the Operation World book is a very thick volume, and it actually has information about every single country in the world. So how in the world are you able to gather information about all the different countries in the world?
Yeah, the gathering of information, of course, has been just utterly transformed by the digital revolution. So in the 1960s, when Operation World began, the challenge was actually gathering reliable data about different countries, especially in, again, sub-Saharan Africa, where there were technological and diplomatic limitations in addition to other things. Today, the challenge is not whether or not we can acquire information, is to filter out the disinformation and the misinformation and write and report and project accurate information that gets to really the heart of the matter when we're talking about understanding a country and then praying for a country from a biblical perspective.
So since the information you're gathering is about Christians and is about the churches in a particular country, so you, I guess, work with churches or denominations or missions organizations who are working in a particular country to get accurate information.
Precisely. Basically, our data gathering process involves three streams of activity. The first one is contacting the actual entities themselves. So if we want to know how many Catholics are in a country or in every country, let's ask the Vatican and get the information from them. If we want to know how many Lutherans, well, let's ask the Lutherans, and so on and so forth. So getting information from the source. How many workers with this particular mission agency are serving in a country? Get it directly. The second would be, I guess, what we call a media survey, where we're reading hundreds of different journals, reports, news sources, blogs, websites, etc., magazines, and gathering what we see as interesting and relevant data that relates to how, from a Christian worldview, we can understand and then pray for a country. The third stream of the information and the research that we do is by asking local experts who are experienced and knowledgeable about their particular sphere of involvement. So if we want to write about Rwanda, then let's ask Rwandan church leaders, Rwandan ministry leaders, Rwandan prayer leaders, How can we write about your country? What should we be saying? What shouldn't we be saying? And how can we be praying in the most relevant and strategic ways? Let's listen to the local experts. So we try to do that for every country.
So what about countries like, say, North Korea or Bhutan or Afghanistan, where maybe there aren't many Christians, or maybe not even an official church? How do you find out what the situation is there, and how can you know that the information is accurate?
Yeah, the accuracy of, let's say, Christian data or spiritual information, if we can put it that way, is sometimes very difficult to ascertain, of course, especially when the regime that's in charge of the nation is actively hostile to the church. That makes it more difficult. But there are research specialists whose work and whose ministry focuses on trying to gather reliable data about precisely these types of situations. There are committed believers who are either adjacent to or often have the opportunity to go into countries, not to do evangelism, but simply to get local insight. There are also many people who, of course, have fled from these countries. You would easily be able to find the testimonies of North Koreans who have fled North Korea, but who lived all of their lives in North Korea up to the point where they left the country. So they will have some very deep insight as to what the situation is there, and will often have good information as well about the composition and the size and the needs of the body of Christ in those places.
Right. Well, so basically you work with a lot of data from churches and from Christians from all over the world. So you probably have a pretty good insight or a pretty good viewpoint into seeing kind of what the global Christendom is looking like. And here in the West, of course.
We hope so. We hope
yeah. Now we will find out. So here in the West, it seems like the church is dying, it's withering away. Different ideologies and philosophies are kind of taking its place as an answer to people's questions. So how does it look as bleak globally? And kind of how would you describe the state of Christianity in the world today?
Yeah, this is a really good and a really important question, especially for those of us who live in countries that have long been associated with Christendom. And I think there's two ways to answer this question. And one of them is, it is as bleak as it is in some ways, in that we do see, statistically speaking, at least a rapid decline of people who identify themselves as Christians, whether it's Finland or Portugal or Ireland or Greece or any other corner of, let's say, Europe. The same would be true for Australia, New Zealand, and North America as well. We do see a decline, or at least a stagnation, of the church, very broadly speaking. But I would give two different explanations for this. And one of them is not so much a statistical explanation, but more of a qualitative answer. And that is that in most of these countries, the media that we consume to get our picture of Christianity tends not to be Christian media. It tends to be secular media, which at best is skeptical, but is often also antipathetic or even hostile to Christianity. And so, of course, if that is the stream through which we are understanding the state of the church, the state of spiritual things in our nations, then it is going to be painted more negatively than would otherwise be the case. So, and it's important to be mindful of that. The other element is that I would say that Christendom as a construct is statistically in decline, but I don't know if the proportion of people who are disciples of Jesus is in decline. I think that possibly we're actually seeing an increase in that. The problem is that so many of our countries have been culturally Christian for so long, with state churches that people are born into rather than choosing into, that what we're seeing right now is, it's a a statistical decline of people who call themselves Christian, but I don't necessarily think that it's a decline in the number of people who faithfully practice a relationship with Christ. And so what's happening is probably a negative term, but for lack of a better term, the dead wood of the church is being cut away. And what remains is the part that is still alive and vibrant and active. And while it's sad to see that decline, at the same time, I think of biblical examples like the 12 disciples or the 72 or Gideon's army of 300, that God does not need a huge number of people to actually make an historic impact on the outcome and the destiny of a nation.
Right. So is the church growing like significantly somewhere in the world, and why is it growing there?
Yeah, it's a fascinating little tidbit of information that for the last 100+ years, the number of people in the world who would call themselves Christian of any denomination has been essentially 1 out of every 3 people in the world. It was like that more than 100 years ago, and it's like that today. Now, the proportion of humanity that sees themselves as Christian hasn't changed, but the places where Christians are has very significantly changed, especially in the last 30 years or so. So on one side, what we were seeing is, of course, the fading of Christendom in the Western world, but we're also seeing a rapid slowing down of population growth in the Western world. And so it was not that long ago, it was only, maybe 40 years now, that the majority of Christians in the world have been in the majority world, or what's often called, or was until recently called, the global south. So Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They have the vast majority of the human population, and now they have the significant majority of people who identify as Christians as well. And that is where the growth of the church is occurring most rapidly. Firstly, in Africa, secondly, in Asia, and thirdly, in Latin America, where the large majority have been Christian for centuries, but what type of Christian they are and the growth of the population has been significant more recently. So the proportion of humanity who are Christian hasn't really changed, but where the growth is occurring has very significantly changed over the last century. Now the growth is happening at the fringes of what would have been identified as the Christian world. Places like Iran, places like, dare I say, Afghanistan, places like parts of Southeast Asia and China and the Sahel belt across the center of Africa.
So why is the church growing in places like that?
Well, this is a boring answer, but it's probably the most accurate answer. And that is that those are the places where Christians are having babies. And most people who are born in Christian families stay as Christians. Not always. And of course, there are people who become Christians in their lifetime. So places that have high birth rates are places where the church is growing. But that's probably not what you're talking about. The other part is a vast oversimplification. But really, the bottom line of church growth is the church grows in places where people share the gospel. And the church grows most in places where people share the gospel most. Now, what sharing the gospel looks like, what it means, what are the attendant activities that go with that? Is it preaching in the street? Is it large-scale evangelistic events? Is it one-to-one relational evangelism? Is it the kind of holistic, integral community work that involves caring for the poor, for the widows and orphans, providing for the physical, emotional, and psychological needs of the marginalized? Well, what evangelism looks like in places where the church is growing is always a little bit different. And it, of course, depends on what group is doing it. But it's an undeniable fact that churches, communities, denominations, and countries where the gospel is shared most are the places where the church is growing the fastest. Places where the gospel is not shared are the places where the church is declining the fastest. And I think this is part of the challenge that we face in a a multi-religious and secularized Western world is that we have, in many cases, ceased to be sharers of the gospel. And as a result, the church is no longer growing. Again, it's very oversimplified, but it's a fundamental principle of church growth and church decline.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting because, of course, now many Christians are talking about in the West how important it is to raise your children into the Christian faith and to really teach them the Christian faith. Maybe people have been kind of like not so, or have not taken it so seriously in the past few decades, perhaps because kind of our culture has seemed to be kind of Christian-y in style, so it hasn't been so important. But now maybe people are taking it more seriously, and of course, like evangelism and mission work and all of that. Maybe churches in the West are also kind of slowly waking up to that as well. So this is kind of interesting to hear, even though it's a simplification, but still to hear this.
Yeah, and when it comes to families, I think that what we're not aware of until we step out of our own culture so much is how thoroughly secularized so much of the Western world has become. And it's affected our own thinking as Christians about what's appropriate and what's right. And whether it's sharing the good news about Jesus with a friend or a colleague or a relative, or whether it's about how we raise our children and disciple them. The most important discipleship factor in any person's life is probably the home in which they grow up. And when we have a culture that actively gravitates against raising children to be, solid disciples of Christ, then we need to probably, adapt and compensate for those forces that are at play. This is not some great conspiracy or anything necessarily dark or nefarious on the parts of, government policies necessarily, but it's just that to really raise children to be disciples of Christ requires going against the stream of popular culture today. And that takes a deliberate and conscious effort to do so.
Sure. Yeah. So it seems like globally the new kind of religion is maybe is individualism and materialism. And it seems like that they are not only Western vices, but they are kind of like through globalism, through, the internet. Those are kind of the values that are everywhere. And maybe that maybe those are things that kind of have overwritten people's interest in Christianity or in God. Is it so globally, or what do you think?
Yeah, I would add to individualism and materialism, hedonism, probably, and narcissism as well. One thing I would hasten to add is that the degree of individualism does range from culture to culture. And living in Asia, as I am currently, it's notable that, while individuals still do matter, there is much more of a communal or corporate or group mindset that people make choices and live out their lives with that aspect of understanding much more deeply part of their identity and part of their values, and therefore their decision-making vectors, compared to our hyper-individualistic Western cultures. So that is a factor. But even in these places, what happens once we become globalized is that influences tend to also spread very quickly. So we are seeing it. But what we're also seeing is that I think people are waking up to or increasingly aware of the emptiness that comes from this particular cocktail of the era in which we live. We have known since the beginning that material wealth cannot fill a spiritual void. We know this for a fact because these are two different planes of existence in a sense, and no amount of money is going to be able to fill a spiritual void that God has made. Jesus himself said, you can gain the world, but lose your soul. And what can a man give in exchange for his soul? There is no amount of wealth in the world that can buy that. So people are increasingly aware of this. I think that ultimately the moral bankruptcy of materialistic worldview is becoming realized even in the Western world. There's a lot of good research that indicates that the emerging generation in Europe and in North America is more spiritually receptive than their predecessors, probably in part because of the very fact that modernist, materialist worldview was shown to be inadequate and incomplete without some spiritual elements also being incorporated. So I would say that in the West, there's not very much interest in religion per se, but it doesn't make the message of Jesus and a genuine spirituality that's reflected by the values of Scripture, the person of Christ, and the power of the Holy Spirit. When those things are lived out and demonstrated authentically, there is a strong appealing factor. I would also say that individualism is less strong in Africa and Asia in particular, but also the degree of engagement in religious activity has probably intensified rather than declined. And we see this in the rise of religious fundamentalism around the world, whether it's Islamic fundamentalism like Boko Haram in West Africa, or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or ISIS, whether it's Hindu fundamentalism that we see in particular political groups in India. Even within Buddhism, there are some sometimes violent radical Buddhist groups. And of course, within Christianity, there is that type of religious fundamentalism that can be toxic, unbiblical, and even violent at times. And so much of that intensification of religious fervor is a response to and a reaction against the creeping secularization that we see at work all around the world. So I wouldn't say that religion or religiosity or spirituality is declining in the world. I think that the way humans are interacting with it these days is quite different because of globalization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess a big part of that is the internet and social media, and a lot of course, we also often talk about the bad sides, negative sides of social media, and how different, bad things can spread around a lot quicker. But social media, I guess, is also used, well, basically the gospel is also spread through social media. How do you see that? Is that like a significant factor in the world?
It's impossible to overstate the impact of social media on our brains, just in terms of our brain chemistry, but also in terms of its effectiveness and its damage as a tool in terms of Christian ministry. When used wisely, when used appropriately, when used sensitively, social media can be a very powerful tool for evangelism, for discipleship, for apologetics, for encouraging believers, even for different forms of fellowship and worship and Bible study together. But of course, when it's not used wisely, when it's used without discernment, when it's used out of our fallen human instincts, rather than our best Christian principles, then we see that kind of narcissism and selfishness and judgmentalism and impatience begin to manifest in our own attitudes, and then in the attitudes of the group, or even the broader culture that we occupy. So I would say that intrinsically, it's a neutral tool. It's not fundamentally a good thing or fundamentally a bad thing. The problem is that it is such a powerful tool that if it's not used wisely, its capacity to do harm is just exponentially more than previous communication tools of the past, because of the unique aspects of social media that affect our brain chemistry, affect our self-image, affect even the very ways that we communicate with one another. So very powerful, which can be used, of course, in kingdom-oriented ways, but also the kingdom of darkness wants to cause damage and destruction and hurt to people, and we see that often a very common thing as well. Mm-hmm.
Well, from that we can jump to COVID, and COVID definitely has been an era that has seen an escalation Certainly. Of a lot of negative things. many churches closed during COVID, and the church services were moved online and so on. What are the effects of that? Have people returned to church, or do you see, like, have you seen statistics, or what's your view on this? What are the kind of the long-term effects that we can see now?
Yeah, there's no single outcome that's consistent everywhere, especially with as diverse as our world is. You know, what the outcomes in a place like China, where there's still a zero COVID policy and harsh lockdowns that are still occurring compared to other places that are now essentially fully open for business, as it were. But I would say that the most notable impact is, number one, any place where church was essentially a consumer activity. I participate in church because of what I can get out of it. I consume whatever form of media, the preaching, the worship, the other elements that cause me to participate in church. If it's only about what I can take from the church, then the rate of participation has significantly decreased. Of course, it was, popular and trendy, and we saw people logging into various forms of digital church on Zoom or on live stream or on all kinds of modes. But now that we're kind of moving to a post-COVID world, people who were not engaged in the relational and community aspect of church life have kind of dropped off the map, and it's difficult to convince them to return to the inconvenience and the difficulties of flesh and blood, real world fellowship with other people who are imperfect people who are growing in their own Christ-likeness as well. Doing church requires face-to-face relationships, and face-to-face relationships are hard work. They can be awkward. They can be draining. They can consume our time and our emotions and our energy. But there's no way to really be the church in a solely digital function. It can be a both and. And so I think that's the most significant negative impact of COVID, is that people who were already maybe limited or operating from a consumer mindset of church, it will be very difficult to draw them back into fellowship. But I think we've also seen an uptick in people's desperation spiritually. We've seen an uptick in the ways that people were using digital media to creatively connect to one another. I think that we've seen a major groundswell of prayer movements emerge during COVID as people began to connect to one another digitally, not just to pray for one another and their communities, but to pray for global issues as well.
Yeah, that's really encouraging. And I think we have seen here as well that people from especially like New Age movements or from New Age belief systems have actually found Christ during the COVID era for one reason or another, which is great. Well, how did COVID affect missionary work? It kind of like seems that, travel was difficult and, visas, all these like lockdowns, everything. Was even missionary work kind of allowed, or was it even possible in many parts of the world? Or do you have any insight into that?
There was, overall, it was a significantly negative impact on global mission. Number one, because of the prevention of the movement of people. It's hard to go to the mission field. Many people had to flee the country where they were serving in order to not be locked down there. Secondly is the devastating economic impact of COVID has meant that many missionaries, especially those from the global south, no longer had the economic capacity to go or to be sent to the places where God was calling them. And so that's been increasingly difficult. I would also say that during that era, those 2 years of COVID, maybe where we weren't meeting as we normally would, there was a real loss of impetus in terms of casting mission vision. Missionary speakers no longer had a means to access church services where they would maybe be a guest speaker quite frequently. mission conferences where especially a younger generation of people are exposed to the spiritual needs of the world and challenged to become part of the solution. Those were suspended for a couple of years. And so all of that momentum, giving, of course, was reduced as well because people suddenly had more urgent priorities with regard to their limited income and their limited giving capacity. So COVID put a major dent in mission. In some cases, COVID allowed local expressions of ministry to flourish, especially in meeting, the holistic needs of people who were suffering. But in the places where the church doesn't exist yet, or where the church is very small relative to the local population, the places where mission at the frontiers needs to be done, those were the places that experienced the greatest setbacks in terms of any sense of momentum or impetus in relation to doing mission. And so now we're at the point where we need to begin to see that reemerge. Fortunately, as I was saying earlier, I think that there was a groundswell of an awareness of the accessibility of prayer and intercession. And therefore, there has been a lot more praying for these places. And perhaps now, as doors begin to open again, we will see the fruit of that prayer as people re-engage into the mission field.
Yeah. Well, relating to the missionary work, so Jesus gave us the Great Commission, and now we've had a little setback kind of during COVID in missionary work, but basically for 2,000 years, the gospel has been spreading all over the world, and like you said, 1/3 of the global population is basically Christian. So where are we now, with the Great Commission? What would it take to finish the Great Commission, and can we even really measure that? And out of the 1/3 of the population, are they all really born again believers, or are they maybe also cultural Christians and all of that? Okay, that was a lot of questions in one question, but let's hear some of your thoughts.
Okay, well, for starters, I would say that the majority of people who would answer the question, are you Christian, in the broadest sense, I wouldn't be confident that most of them are genuine believers, but only God knows the heart, of course. But I would say that there are many who are, but there are some, as you've mentioned, who are purely cultural Christians. This is something they inherited because of the country they're in, because of the ethnic group that they're a part of, because of the family that they were born into, but it never became a real thing for them. And so that's a reality. At the same time, even though we've had hundreds of years of Protestant missionary effort, and of course, many hundreds of years of Catholic and Orthodox mission effort before Protestantism even existed, and now this new movement of indigenous Christianity emerging from within Africa, within Asia, within Latin America, with all of this effort, all of the Christian radio, Christian literature, Christian television stations and satellite, Christian internets and websites, there's still probably about 27% of the world that doesn't have meaningful access to the gospel. So the answer to your question is really, number one, what is the Great Commission? How do we define it? How do we measure it? There is a very robust debate within missiological circles about whether the Great Commission is even something that can be completed and whether or not we should be approaching it as such. But I would say that it seems incumbent on the church that every person who's alive should have the opportunity, if they're interested, to know about Jesus. And that is certainly far from the case today. There are over 2 billion people in the world today who don't have any meaningful access to the good news. In other words, if they wanted to find out about Jesus, would they be able to? And the answer for over 2 billion people is no. Also, from the ethno-linguistic people group perspective, which is an important one when you look at biblical frameworks of belief, there are still thousands of groups that only have very, very few Christians within their group. So the church within that language or culture group isn't large enough to multiply and to have a significant impact on the entirety of the group. They need help from outside, maybe from a related neighboring group that has a stronger church, maybe from overseas, because there's literally no one to share the good news, so someone has to come from somewhere else to do so. So there is a lot of work to be done. There is a lot of effort to measure these things as best we're able. It will always be imperfect measurements, of course. And there is a lot of momentum to see if we can finish this task or complete or fulfill the Great Commission. I don't know how all of these things relate to eschatology, of course, because everyone's going to have a different interpretation of what the eschatological implications of the world we live in today is. But I do know that Jesus, told us that we should live such lives of godliness as to wait for and hasten the coming of the day of God. And so how we live and how faithful we are in our own lives of godliness does actually have an impact on God's plan for the nations and God's plan to consummate history with the return of Christ and the fulfillment of his kingdom. Humans, and the church in particular, of course, are here precisely because God expects us to have an influence on his agenda, his program, his schedule for the fulfillment of history according to his plan. And I believe that the Great Commission is a fundamental and key part of that. We're not called to simply wait and do nothing until Jesus returns. We're called to go and occupy until he comes. So I can't say how close we are. I can't say if we'll get there in our lifetime, but I can say that there certainly is a lot more work to do. And there are, as I mentioned, billions of people who haven't had the chance to hear about Jesus at all. And I think it's only fair that they should have an opportunity when we've been so blessed and even spoiled by the wealth of resources that we have access to, where we can experience Jesus, get to know him, and know his beauty, his goodness, and his kindness.
Well, you work for the Operation World project, and basically you kind of like directly are working to aid the fulfilling of the Great Commission. And Operation World was created as a prayer guide. So can you give us maybe an example or two of how prayer has historically, helped to advance the gospel in the world, and give us some motivation? Why should we start praying for the world?
Yeah, so many ways to answer this question, but I think one of the most important ways is that, we need to understand prayer as communion with God, as being in conversation with our Maker, the one who created us, the one who knows us best, the one who knows every dark corner of our heart and yet still loves us with an everlasting love. And so why wouldn't we want to be in conversation with someone who is like that? And so first of all, prayer is important because prayer is how we were designed. We are spiritual creatures made to be that way, to be in communion with the one who made us. Second of all, I don't know if we can ever scientifically measure the outcomes of our prayers. I don't know that anyone has ever managed to create a direct correlation. If we reduce it to a science, I think that it loses part of its enjoyment and part of its mystery that is really a part of prayer. But it was Archbishop Temple, who was in the 20th century an archbishop in the Church of England, and he said, a very pithy and brief way to remember it: when I pray, coincidences happen, and when I don't pray, they don't. This is true, of course, on an individual level, but I believe it's also true on a worldwide level. And one really good example of this is the recently deceased, or let's say promoted to glory, Brother Andrew, God's smuggler, the founder of Open Doors. In the early 1980s, he initiated a 7-year global prayer movement to see the tearing down of the Iron Curtain and the opening of the Eastern Bloc to the gospel once again. And almost exactly after 7 years of that prayer campaign, the Berlin Wall came down, and it was the beginning of a very rapid end for European communism. And we saw the message of the gospel pouring back into former Soviet countries. And when he saw the outcome of 7 years of sustained global prayer for that, he said, okay, now let's pray for 10 years for the opening up of the Muslim world to the good news of Jesus. And from 1991, 10 years of global prayer for the Muslim world. This was around the same time that the 30 Days of Prayer for the Muslim World initiative began, which produces an excellent booklet every year. After 10 years of unprecedented prayer for the Muslim world, 9/11 happened, and then the dominoes began to topple that brought about a season in this last decade where more Muslims have encountered Jesus through dreams and visions, through evangelism, through other Muslims who have met Jesus, and maybe they've kept their Muslim identity, but they're followers of Jesus, or maybe they've converted, quote unquote, to become Christians culturally even. But we've seen more Muslims encounter and experience Jesus in this last 10, 20 years than ever before in history. But we only get a sense of the impact of these things, of course, when we take a very long view and when we take a very broad view. When we look at countries like Albania or Mongolia, that in the 80s seemed to be impossible cases when it came to breakthroughs for the gospel. Now we see thriving, growing, vibrant churches that are sending missionaries out to other countries from Albania and from Mongolia. And when we look at what the turmoil that's happening in Iran today, for example, this is in part, of course, God is moving many pieces around the board, as it were. But there has been sustained prayer for Iran ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979 to experience the living Christ. And we have seen in these last 10 or so years more Iranians meeting Jesus than ever before in the history of that land. And so, of course, it comes accompanied with turmoil. It comes accompanied sometimes with suffering or violence or conflict. But we also see the birth and the rapid growth and maturity of churches in these places where not so long ago there was virtually nothing happening. So when you take the long view, you begin to see that, sustained, global, persistent, faith-filled prayer really does have the ability to have impact on an entire nation and on entire people.
And maybe it's also a positive thing for us, for our faith and for our spiritual lives, to focus on praying for other nations, because then that kind of helps us to look outwards and not always be, inward turned and just depressed about our own problems, but
Absolutely.
kind of see the bigger picture.
Prayer, prayer is not meant to, it was never designed to be a shopping list of things that I want for myself, for God, the sky genie, to give to me to make me happy or to make my life easier. Intercession is a key part of prayer, and the fundamental job of intercession is to stand in the gap on behalf of someone else. And those 2 billion plus someone else's who have never experienced the good news of Jesus are certainly worthy of our intercession. I think there's also a great joy, and we see this in other parts of our lives, when we are giving of ourselves in a selfless, generous kind of way, and we see other people impacted by that. It brings satisfaction, it brings joy, it brings a sense of fulfillment that doing things that are meant to satisfy ourselves cannot do on their own. The other thing I would say is, as you engage in a global vision of prayer, it often is the case that God takes your prayers and then calls you to become the answer to your own prayer. And whether that's, praying for your neighbor who's, maybe noisy, or maybe grumpy, or maybe unfriendly, or maybe, their house or their yard is really messy. When you begin to pray for them and for God to reach and touch and impact them, sometimes God uses you as the answer to your prayer. When you pray for the people of Afghanistan, or for Ukrainian refugees, or for migrants who are trying to escape from violence in the slums of Africa or Brazil or Indonesia, sometimes those prayers actually get answered by God calling you to go and be the answer. And that's such an exciting life. If you talk to people who have given their own lives to serving the kingdom of God cross-culturally, it's a challenge. It's difficult. It can be heartbreaking at times, but it brings a sense of joy and fulfillment and purpose that few other things can bring.
Right. Great. Thank you, Jason, for these encouraging words and casting a vision for prayer. And basically, people can find information how to pray for different countries from the website. Is it operationworld.org?
That's right. Yeah, you can go to the website. We have a free mobile app that mirrors the information on the website as well that you can use to pray for any country on any day of the year and to begin to expand your kingdom vision. We also, of course, find it really exciting because, as you mentioned, sometimes when we only look at our own countries, it can be a little bit discouraging. But when we read about and pray into the amazing things that God is doing somewhere else, it can fill us with faith and with joy.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason, for taking time to talk with us today.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Ja kiitos kaikille kuulijoille ja katselijoille myöskin. Palautetta tästä jaksosta voi lähettää osoitteeseen kujalla.podcast@gmail.com. Ja palataan sitten ensi kerralla uusin aihein taas eetteriin. Moikka moi!